Welcome to Stratwatch. Here in episode 10, we'll be covering the offense on Gibraltar. We'll be looking at all 3 points, starting with the catwalk and server room, the hangar, and then obviously into the launch pad. We'll be looking at the multiple games from the OG Invitational and the Alienware Monthly over the last week, and we'll be specifically looking at how the offenses broke down and destroyed the setups of those points independently. This episode may end up going a bit longer, so it is subdivided into 3 different sections so that you guys can easily click around to each section of the map that you want to study. Again, thank you so much for watching Stratwatch. I am RaptorZ, and I'll be walking you through this episode. First, we're going to take a look at point A, or point 1, which is known as the server room point, or the beginning part of Gibraltar. The server room is the most common setup on the defense, and usually will feature a Symmetra, or most commonly a Lucio, recently, and then as well as a Mercy for your support. Your tank is usually a Reinhardt who sits on the ramp, as well as a Roadhog sitting with him. Usually you will see a Pharah and a Soldier with this, but there have been other combinations that you can run with this, such as Reaper or such as Genji. But again, the goal of this setup is that you set up in the server room, and that you jump out at the opponents as they move up the hill and around the corner. Here we're going to see Cloud9 do something a little bit different to break down that setup. Normally, one of the strategies to break the server room is to use the catwalk to the right and rush in and bust the setup. But Cloud9 came up with something slightly different in the Alienware Monthly, and it piqued my interest. Instead of running and busting the setup, which is especially what a Symmetra wants you to do, because you basically put yourself under the fire of all the sentries as well as the heroes inside of it, Cloud9 goes with their 2 DPS that are mobile, the Genji and the Pharah that they're running, and set up on the catwalk facing the ramp of the server room. They then use the Reinhardt and the Winston to set up on the cart using their barriers in the cart as a buffer so that the heroes on the catwalk can freely rain rockets and shurikens into the server room. This forces the defense into an offensive position that they didn't originally want to be in, where the longer it takes for them to get out and stop this setup, the longer the cart has pushed closer to the point. This ultimately forces the defense into aggressing onto the offense, and it gives you the peak advantage as the offense as they are forced to shoot into you. While Cloud9 does not end up scoring on this point here, on this push specifically, they end up getting the cart within to a few meters, and they end up scoring on the next push. But this is a more unique way of breaking down the server room that I noticed recently in the Alienware Monthly. So this is just one of the ways that you can break down the server room. Another interesting way that we saw recently to break the server room is a strategy from LG. Now, instead of relying again on bursting or busting the setup inside the server room, they relied on this idea of using a pick mechanic from both a Hanzo and a Widowmaker, not just one but 2 snipers, to deal with the setup. Again, this relies on the idea that if you get picks, you can easily take the setup, because as they're losing heroes, it makes it much easier for you to get off your push, or successfully score your push. So Seagull and Gods are going to be using the 2 snipers to constantly rain fire on this setup. Every successful kill they get makes it easier for the following 4 teammates that they have to easily get around and deal with the server room. Again, what makes the server room so strong is having those heroes stacked in there and forces the offense into choke points to push into it. Is what makes it so strong naturally, is that you're forced into that awkward position as the offense. But if you go with a pick setup, or like we saw recently the Cloud9 setup, you can prevent them from being able to actually set up the way they want to. There's also a very good play in this moment that happens that I'd like to highlight. Seagull uses the Dragon Strike to clear the server room. This is something we saw, or will end up seeing a lot, in the OG Invitational, as they played a lot of Hanzo specifically, LG that is, as well as other teams started picking up as well. Liquid was one of them. And Hanzo can use Dragon Strike to clear the server room, and you notice that he angled it in such a way that they couldn't come down the main ramp, and they were forced the long way out of the server room. They get a series of picks, starting with Gods getting a headshot on Sure4, and then it just goes downhill from there for the side of Cloud9. But again, this strategy of LG relies on the idea that you can get picks and constantly use your 2 snipers to isolate and deal with 1 hero at a time, just by either headshots or dealing a significant amount of damage and forcing them back. We will now be going over what is the most common way to break the server room. However, I feel like these 2 more recently developed ways are better in nature at dealing with it than the standard bust. The standard burst that you see to break the server room setup in Gibraltar point, the first point, is again using a Roadhog and usually a Reinhardt. Here we see Liquid using the Hanzo. Again, this is an adaptation that was seen throughout the OG Invitational, primarily started by LG, but this kind of composition of just breaking a server room setup is how you want to go about doing it. They use the Roadhog to go into the room through the catwalk, as well as other heroes in the back, and then clean up the heroes in it, pushing them out, and then cleaning them out one by one, using the Roadhog's pick mechanic. Now, although this is not the best footage to explicitly demonstrate how the bust works, the bust is also usually reliant on a little bit of luck and execution in heat of the moment. The executions that are being developed now for the burst, or the bust of the setup, rely a lot more on finesse and using a picking mechanic or a hero such as Hanzo to quickly deal with the heroes. So that was Gibraltar Point 1, guys. We'll be moving into the hangar phase now, and if you would like to go back to this part, you can do so in the next waiting screen. Here, you will be able to click all of the different points on the map, including the one that we just went over. Next up is the hangar phase, and the last point again is the launch pad. Here we're going to go into the hangar phase. Again, normally what you'll see from the defensive side here is a pretty standard composition. A Pharah and Soldier for your DPS, Lucio and Mercy for your supports, and then a Roadhog and Reinhardt for your 2 tanks. You will have the Soldier set up on top of the shuttle, so he can easily rain down bullets any direction that the offense is coming through. The Pharah will set up there so she can boost up into the air and easily rain rockets down on offenders pushing forward. This is the ideal setup for the shuttle room and is pretty much the most common scene setup. Breaking the server room takes a lot of finesse and a lot of tempo again. I don't ever want to leave you guys in a position where I feel like saying that if you guys do not have tempo, then you are out, because that is not the right way to approach this. But I want to highlight how important it is that you do have the tempo. The ground you can gain from using it makes a huge world of difference when the entire position that the defense can set up in the hangar is so advantageous to them that it makes it almost impossible for the offense to consistently get quality pushes off. But again, part of what I want to highlight here is that there are 2 main ways you can go about pushing it. The first one is deathballing by grouping together. Now this is basically what Liquid is doing to get through Cloud9 here, and this is what we'll see a lot of the time. Another instance or another composition that you will see where you will deathball like this is instead of having a Hanzo, you will run a Reaper. Now what you will do with this strategy is just accept the fact that they're going to have shuttle and high ground control. But with the Roadhog being able to hook targets in, then being shredded by the Reaper and the Soldier, you can consistently deal with these targets, and when they do push into your deathball or attempt to fight your deathball, the amount of damage you can output in a close range is absolutely disgusting and makes it incredibly hard for them to fight it out. And this is pretty much the strategy that we see coming out from the side of Liquid. Now, although you see Pharah as a target to flank around and to deal with setups that way, she is also very good when you stack with your team properly. But it is important to note that the power of Pharah is, of course, her verticality. In this section, we're going to highlight how important it is that you use your ultimates properly and you execute fights cleanly if you're going to get into the shuttle room. For the last 4 minutes of this game between Liquid and Cloud9, they've been ineffective at getting onto the shuttle or pushing under the shuttle and actually getting a push off. They end up having a very scrappy fight here at the end that allows them to take the point, but ultimately they have a very hard time leading up to this point because of the setup that Cloud9 has. I want to highlight here that this is why having tempo going into the shuttle is so important, because if you do not have the tempo that you need to control the shuttle room, then the defense is at such an inherent advantage that you will bleed fight after fight until the time on the clock is ticked down to almost 0, and it becomes very hard to execute your push at that point. But again, Liquid, one way to get around that, and we can highlight and go back to that, is that they didn't have very many ultimates, but neither did Cloud9. They whittled down both sides to low ultimates, and they were able to capitalize on a good resurrection from the hang, as well as this last 30-45 seconds of fighting to be able to effectively take the point. This is more reliant on your crisis management, but also on the setup that you're seeing from them. For the previous 4 minutes, they were unable to take that point because they also were not running a Reaper, and they were running a Pharah instead. So if, a Winston. So if you do want to push that point, you do have to consider how you're going to do it. And the deathball strategy is what they end up executing, and without ultimates, it's a lot easier. In this next part of the hangar phase, we're going to look at tempo and how important it is that you have it to take the point. Again, we emphasized it a little bit on the last point, but if you're going to run a package of mobility-based heroes, tempo is something you need to be controlling the entire game, and this is something that Cloud9 is very good at. We're going to be witnessing here as Sure4 and Kai use the mobility package of heroes. Again, you're not going to be running a Roadhog in this situation, and you're going to be running a Genji instead of a Pharah. We also have Reaver on a Widowmaker, but that is a flavor pick that they decided for this match that would work well for them. But again, the tempo that they have previously taking the point allows them to set up more effectively in the shuttle room and not allow the defense to get the exact setup they want at the beginning, allowing the side of Cloud9 on the offense to be able to consistently position and take better fights. Now, although the beginning of the fight does not go that well, this is a good instance of defense taking the initiative and getting their setup and then winning the fight. I want to highlight that using a mobility package like this relies on using your tempo and using the Winston and the Genji in combination. It is very hard to find a specific instance of film this weekend, as there were not many clean examples of this setup taking the hanger phase in 1 or 2 pushes. Mostly it took more. But what I do want to highlight is that if you can set up like that with tempo, using the Winston and the Genji, they can jump on targets together. Obviously, the Mercy would be the primary one, and they're able to just dish out insane amount of damage to those weaker targets. But if they're not able to do that, then it becomes much harder, and the comp pretty much falls apart. If you're not running a Widowmaker, you're most likely running something either along the lines of a Roadhog or a Pharah, possibly even a Soldier in that position. But at the end of the day, this composition is going to heavily rely on your Winston and your Genji working out. And as you can see here, even though it takes 2 pushes for Cloud9 to get it farther down close to the cap point, it is very important to note that even with the sheer amount of tempo that they had in this game, specifically coming back from or from taking that point on that fight, it did take them multiple fights as well as 1 wipe to actually be able to take this point. The shuttle room is incredibly difficult to navigate and incredibly difficult to take. I do want to give you guys one example of what it looks like when you have momentum coming out of taking the first point, and then you're able to use that momentum to take the second point. This is a slightly cleaner example than the one from Alienware. However, this example still relies a lot more on the fact that the tempo coming from taking point 1 mattered a lot more per se than the actual composition being executed properly. Now, obviously, the execution of the composition is done well by Cloud9, but they're able to pretty much completely force Liquid away from ever being able to set up on the catwalk or on the shuttle. And this is a product of having your tempo from the first point. And this is what this film wants to highlight here, or want to highlight from it, is that if you're able to take that first point of the server room and then move into the hangar phase, you want to immediately snowball it as much as possible. Cloud9 pushed forward with almost 4 members at one point to make sure that Liquid was not able to set up properly. In doing so, they were able to get the payload under the catwalk before Liquid was even able to set up. If you can do this effectively, then you will not need to worry about your composition as much. Again, this works with any composition, whether it be Deathball or whether it be this kind of setup with mobility being Genji and Pharah, and obviously the Winston, the package of mobility. But again, guys, I want to highlight that tempo is key to taking the hangar phase, and if you do not have tempo, then you will have to rely on clean, executed pushes. Now we will be moving into the final point, the launch pad. Again, if you would like to skip back to the previous 2 parts, you can do so here. The video is clickable on any of them below, and we will now be moving into the launch pad. In the last section of Gibraltar, the launch pad, the setup is a little more amorphous, as you don't need to strictly set up on the catwalk above the launch pad, but you can set up a few other places. Again, the most common setup that you'll see here is pretty much the golden setup for Gibraltar. You have your DPS package of Soldier and Pharah. You run a tank package of Winston and Reinhardt, and you will also commonly sub out Winston for Roadhog, especially increasingly more so these days. And then your support package is, of course, Mercy and Lucio. Breaking this relies on a few things, but again, I want to highlight that the setup that you'll use is either one of 2 setups on Gibraltar mainly. You have a Deathball setup with Reaper and Roadhog, and then you will also run a mobility-based setup. The mobility-based setup, again, relies more on this Genji, Pharah, Winston, and also you can use Soldier in that setup because Winston can sprint very quickly while he's not able to jump targets per se. He can assist the targets who are jumping targets. And of course, Pharah can as well with her long-range rocket spam and her mobility inherently by being a target or a character that can fly throughout the maps. But this package itself relies on being very aggressive and jumping on the setup regardless of where they are. As you can see here, Cloud9 is doing a very good job of just playing very aggressive and getting in the faces of the defense, regardless of what they perceive is the setup. They also are focusing their targets well, killing the Mercy very early in the fight to prevent any resurrection. Now, while that is slightly a positioning error on the Hang, that can also be an attribution to the fact that C9 is doing a very good job target focusing and dealing with the targets they need to. But if you can use your tempo from the previous point again, that is a lot of offense in Overwatch is continuing to control the tempo by using the tempo you've gained to win the next fight. You're able to take this launchpad point pretty easily, especially because the compositions that come from the hangar phase are also the compositions that tend to win on the last point in Gibraltar. You do not need to switch up your compositions generally, so if you're running either a death ball or you're running this jump comp, you can effectuate it either way. It just matters that you execute it properly and you get on the point. Specifically, the defense here has a hard time recovering in situations like this, but it is done very well by Liquid because they stay the lineup they are and do not switch to heroes that are relying on getting on the point as quickly as possible and basically saying, we just need to get there and defend it, such as D.Va and Tracer. But the defense is still going to have a pretty hard time holding this position in general, and if the offense is able to get to this point, you should be able to cap it more often than you would if you were getting stalled up in the hangar phase. There are more options, and Sure4 is an example of a very good player who uses the side to jump up and execute effective pushes with Genji and get into the flank and also effectuate with Winston. Liquid does end up holding here for a little bit and stalling out against Cloud9, but the inevitable loss of the tempo earlier forces them to use ultimates ineffectively, and basically Cloud9 has been building up ultimates in every single fight. The other film I want to highlight is Luminosity versus Team Liquid. Now here they're going to use a similar composition to the previous footage, but again, I do want to highlight that Roadhog is an option here, but doesn't seem to be seen as much on the last point, this weekend specifically, but that does not mean he has not been seen recently. In another footage on Gibraltar, you can see instances of Roadhog doing a lot of work on this last point. But I want to highlight that another way you can go about breaking defenses on this last point is the angles that you have on this last point as the offense. Most of this is long corridors, or with corners that are very wide, if you want to look at it that way, where once you peek around the corner, you have many areas to see, many areas to shoot, targets to deal with, etc. This is where Luminosity is going to rely on the power of gods. Now, Widow is still a very strong hero, and her pick potential is something that is terrifying to deal with. But this is something that a Pharah-Widow combo specifically can do very well. If your Pharah and Widowmaker are able to land shots together, then you can pretty much take out any target you want. Both dealing 120 damage with direct hits, can take out anyone except for Reaper and Mei and above on those HP pools, with which 200 HP is a pretty standard breaking point for almost every hero in the game. Specifically Soldier, most of your supports, except for your squishier ones, and then even most of your defensive heroes are around that HP pool, being Reaper and Mei at 250, only 10 HP above that. But again, that is one thing you can do, and that is something that can work. But they do end up relying again on this Soldier, and this is where this has become the new meta. This is why you don't see Widowmaker as much, is because the amount of aggression that can come out from the defense. They end up switching over to a Soldier to break this point, because Soldier can offer a lot of what Widow does, and that is the basic logic of why we've seen every single composition be switching to Soldier. Also, again, where we talked earlier about when adding him to Deathball compositions, you're able to easily use the Biotic Field to sustain your death push even more. But Luminosity, again, uses this quick switching and, again, this idea that if you use your packages properly, you can get a lot done. Comboing Seagull and Gods with Enigma jumping on targets, they're able to focus down people quickly and take out the key defenders that they need to be able to take this point. But I also do want to highlight here that if your push isn't working, you need to be able to establish why. Specifically, Luminosity there understood that the Widowmaker was not a good pick in that specific instance based on the composition that Team Liquid was running, and so they vary up their hero to deal with it. But if your hero and composition is okay in theory, then it comes down to a question of play and proper execution. Balancing those two ideas is very hard as players, But if you're able to identify situations based upon the commonalities, i.e. when you see other teams switching from things, a Widow switching away because there's a Genji and a Winston, for instance, that is another situation that you can continuously draw on as a way to deal with those kind of compositions. Again, guys, we went through the 3 points here, and again, I want to highlight that the last 2 points are a lot about using your tempo with specific plays, whether you push upstairs, go under the catwalk for the hangar phase, or whether you push up through main or use flanks with Genji and Winston over the left-hand side on the launch pad. The entirety of breaking the last 2 points is tempo-based and is also fight management-based with good ult management from the offense. You have multiple compositions to work with, and you have multiple packages to work with. Thank you for watching this week's episode of Stratwatch. We went over the Gibraltar offense and how to break all 3 points. We highlighted the importance of using the different packages and what the packages offer, and we highlighted how important it is to use tempo to break the last 2 points. If you guys want to help and support this, if you guys like this video, do subscribe to the channel above and like the video down below. It really helps me out a lot, and if you guys have feedback or comments or ideas, do leave a comment or send me a message. As well as if you guys want to help me support the video series and support me, you can spread the word about Stratwatch through your friends and social media, as well as you guys can consider donations through fan supporting to keep the ads minimal on this series so that I can continue to do them. Thank you so much, guys, for your viewership and support. I can't say it enough how much it means to me, and I hope to continue making these series and hope to continue the series with quality so that you guys can enjoy it. Again, this is Stratwatch episode 10, Gibraltar Offense. I am RaptorZ, and have a great day.